Welcome to the Life of Styn, where our goal is to make your life yours again. You may have noticed I didn't do an episode last week, even after disciplining myself to do an episode each week for quite a long time. I think we're at like 31 videos now or something, and that was for two reasons mainly. One, I didn't really feel a topic come to mind. Now, when I do these episodes, it just comes naturally to me what I want to talk about. And even though there's a lot of topics I want to do or plan on doing in the future, it just doesn't feel like it's time just yet to do it. And secondly, is prioritizing mental health. And in that regard, I want to use this as a reminder for everyone listening to this to prioritize your mental health in healthy ways, of course. Your quality of life is directly related to your mental health. It's okay to take time for yourself. After all, to help the people around you most, you need to be the best version of yourself you can be, and you can't do that if you find yourself struggling to be stable. So it's okay to be a little selfish sometimes. Take time for yourself to do things you like and do basic self-care. Basic self-care can be hard sometimes, like taking a shower, eating a good meal, or going to bed at a good time, getting plenty of rest. But when you do the most basic things, it also creates a healthier mind-body relationship, where one improves the other. And then, of course, give yourself a couple minutes here or there just to take a breath, regroup, be present. I know a lot of us live really busy lives, and sometimes it's hard to just even carve out 5 minutes, but I'm sure you could find a time to carve out just a few minutes for yourself, wherever that may be, to give yourself just some breaths, to forget about everything you have to do, and just give yourself some you time. Even for a little bit, it helps. Anyways, with that small rant out of the way, today we're going to be diving in the ego and help you identify the ego, because in this journey we call life, it's going to be crucial to distinguish what is the ego and what isn't. What is ego, first of all? Well, ego is your sense of self and identity. And it goes so much deeper than we first suspect, because our identity is completely subjective depending on what we were told growing up and what we discovered about ourselves growing up, and our beliefs and culture, our society and surroundings. All these things determine your sense of self, and more times than not, you create a false image of who you actually are, because the ego grabs onto things it likes and rejects the things it doesn't. And why does it do this? Well, simply survival. Let's unpack and inform many of the things going on here. First, you have an ego. You think you're a human being on Earth, and you think you're a citizen of name a country, and the thing about the ego is it's so tricky. The ego believes it's a separate entity from the world. So a you versus the world type scenario. And notice how the ego has to survive as the ego. And survival goes much deeper than just food, water, and shelter. As I've said in previous videos, the ego needs to survive as what it currently believes it is. Like an ego that believes it's a good male born-again Christian has to perpetuate actions that confirm its belief about itself, otherwise it will feel like their whole life is collapsing. And when an ego is threatened, it bolsters its defense and does what it needs to survive as that ego. And that ego also tells the mind the things it needs to hear to perpetuate itself as that ego. This is a powerful defense mechanism, because the mind and ego tell the entity whatever it needs to hear to perpetuate its own state of being. You can already see how tricky and deceptive, and not only that, but do you see how much suffering can be created? Now, one thing to bring to mind, obviously, is that the ego isn't bad or evil or the enemy. It's not you versus the ego. Hell, currently you probably believe you are the ego. But just like anything in life, there are two sides of the coin, and one is necessary for the other to exist. The problem is, more often than not, we take this for granted and diminish the value of this statement completely. Truly take time and think about every good time in your life. Think about the highest highs you've reached. They would not have been possible without the bad. If you only had good times, you wouldn't have anything to contrast it with, and it would be ordinary. The most euphoric experiences would have no value. We would take them for granted, just as we take a lot of the most basic things for granted in our life today. Today, we're going to be introducing a lot of thought experiments, because one thing about starting to be accountable for your life is it gives you the power to control your life, rather than just be controlled by outside circumstances, which mentally are just a reflection of you. You see reality a certain way. And we've talked about how that's entirely subjective to the experiencer. In this way, you don't see an objective reality outside of yourself. You see a reality entirely projected by the mind or the ego. You project yourself out into the reality. You project yourself out into reality, creating a very internal personal experience. In that way, can you see how the ego is actually the root cause of its own suffering or sometimes its own pleasure? When you see a hurt animal, you don't see it playing the woe is me card. You see it handling whatever is the case. But again, like I've said earlier, if both sides of the coin are required, what's the other side of the coin rather than ego? Well, imagine if the ego was a complete illusion. Now, it doesn't matter right now if it is or not. We're simply playing with the idea. Like I said, a lot of thought experiments are going to go on in this episode. So if the ego was a complete illusion, meaning your sense of self, you being a human in a universe with X name and X qualities and X beliefs, what would you be? Or what would the not illusion be? What would be left? If we have ego, what's the other side of the coin? Well, what if I said you weren't an ego, but that you merely adopted the wrong idea about who you were? We won't play victim here. You didn't really have a choice, and just like suffering is necessary to have not suffering, ego is necessary to have not ego. Okay, I'm being broad here because this isn't just a picture that could be painted for you. It's more like I have to give you the brushes and the paint, and you have to paint the picture. Just like numbers are infinite, we have to get you to understand that numbers are infinite because it's an intellectual knowing, because you can't hold every number in your mind all the way to infinity. Just eventually, after counting up so high, you hit the realization that, oh, it goes on forever, but you have to paint that picture for yourself in a way. Now, you hear all the time in Eastern cultures about the ego, the higher self, the no self, or maybe you haven't and this is the first time you heard about it. But what does that all even mean? Because it really does feel like I'm me, a human with a name, a life. You can't deny that in my experience, that feels like what's actually the case. But what if I told you that's a tricky way the ego hides the truth? Just like a placebo is an illusion, the sugar pill didn't do anything. It was your belief that the sugar pill would work is what worked, and made the fundamental change that the pill was supposed to offer. What if we're all disillusioned towards what is the truth? Because think about it, if the ego didn't exist, you wouldn't be biased as towards what you experienced or didn't experience. But on top of that, you wouldn't be biased if you existed or didn't. In another sense, you wouldn't care if you survived or didn't. And even if you existed from a perspective in which you perceived a body and a mind, it wouldn't live very long, would it? What would perfectly balance this being that wasn't biased about reality, that was non-dual in a sense, that doesn't see good or evil, that doesn't discriminate what happens and what doesn't? This sounds like the perfect job for the ego. Because to exist, you must survive. To survive, you must have a sense of something that needs to be survived, right? Where am I getting at here? I'm trying to open your mind to a realm of possibilities that you maybe didn't think possible. Or maybe you were too busy dealing with life's punches and everyday menial tasks as a human to consider these possibilities. Maybe you are someone who sees all this and says, who cares? I got mouths to feed and work to do. No time to mentally masturbate this crap that has no ground in actuality. All those armchair philosophers, they can go play in a corner and talk with each other. But hold on a second. If you can open your mind just a little bit and see, science used to be philosophy, what we widely accept today. And even before then, it was religion, or we widely believed and accepted religion. And I mean, you can kind of see all the problems that led to that, all of the murder, all of the evil that has happened from people preaching the goodest goods. Now, all the things that make our quality of life better and easier have been done by the world's most critical and original thinkers. People have done nothing short of miracles to get to where we are today, but we have been ignoring what the ancient philosophers have said for thousands of years, or we've misinterpreted or taken them too literally, too seriously, following the social norm and never giving room to even explore outside of the realm of what we think is possible. The people who prove that we can do so much more than we know were likely ridiculed, demonized, murdered, crucified, but nevertheless, the miracles that slip through the cracks have made the most radical changes in our reality. And imagine if what I am talking about is one of those things. Something that sounds so outrageous, like curing mental illness, ending suffering, living in bliss and joy 24/7, creating the life you want through your mind, controlling reality with your mind, becoming the version of yourself you want to be, the most perfect version of yourself. What if this is possible and the only thing stopping it is the people that say you can? Seriously, think about all this for yourself. Don't get in your own way. The time I was most ignorant was when I said I wasn't disillusioned. I wasn't self-deceiving myself. This is reality because X, Y, and Z. Later to find out how wrong I was. So to go from a point where I hate myself and the world around me to loving myself and the world around me, as well as creating the life I want for myself, why would you choose to stay in a world where you hate yourself and the world? See how in a certain sense you're responsible for that? Obviously, you didn't get to choose all the cards you were dealt in your life. I'll give you that. But you were responsible for how you chose to deal with those cards, those traumas, those experiences. If we're responsible for our own suffering, how can we alleviate that? And on top of that, even if we made the choices we made up to this point, what are we doing about it now? Because we can't just stay so stuck on how we chose to be responsible for it or to deal with it then. Now we have to, that's already happened. That was then, this is now. Now we have to choose how we deal with those things now. Now listen, this is just going to be the first part of the ego. The ego runs so deep that we don't know anything else, and we have only scratched the surface and who we truly are or could be. We talked in depth about the ego, what the ego was. So for the next few weeks, just try to identify what the ego is. And when the ego arises, try to look and see if you can find something that isn't the ego or isn't projected by the ego. Let it confuse you. Let it spark curiosity into your mind that maybe you aren't the ego. And if you aren't, what could you be? It's an experiment where, of course, I could just give you the answer. But without work to show for the answer, you can never truly appreciate the answer. You'll never fully grasp the answer. And lastly, why? Because this is essential to become all that you can be and more. Now, don't get me wrong, this isn't the one way. There's no such thing. There are infinite paths, but if you find yourself lost on the path and this resonates with you, then you're on the right track to where you need to be. If it doesn't resonate, then it's clear that this isn't the path for you right now. Maybe it will be later, maybe it won't. But all I know is you will figure it out. I'm not preaching some ideology that everyone needs to follow. I'm not saying this is the one true truth and all must obey and listen. Precisely the opposite. The subjectivity of the universe means there's an infinite number of perspectives, and through the law of polarity, they're all equally true and false, meaning there's nothing I could say that could be absolutely true. But if there was an absolute truth, what would it be? We have perspective and subjective reality, relative reality. So if there was one thing that was true regardless of circumstances, what could that be? Well, awareness is the magic key to all this. Probably. Figure out what's true for yourself and have the day you were meant to have.